Okay, guys, good evening. So we continue with the CSS Grid. Yeah, so we are at adding gaps to it. No, we are at this implicit at and explicit. Give me a moment. Set up everything. Okay.
Implicit and explicit rows and columns. So when we declare display grid on an element, that all the grid items are automatically placed inside of a row, even if we haven't created any yet. So if we go and take a look, let's go check it out. Here I have my display grid, and if I come take a look, well, they're all in a row, but they're all just stacking on top of each other, but each one of these is automatically in a row. Just like that. We didn't have to do anything. They're placed on a row, and they're placed on a column too, but that column is, well, it's the full width right now, so there's nothing too fancy going on there. So we are defaulting to only one column. So just to show, if I did come on here and I said my grid template column, say we did 200 pixels, well, I have my 200 pixel width right there. So they are living on my grid automatically. So we can see that that is working. I'm going to switch this over to rows and say we had some grid template rows of 50, 100, and 200 pixels. So I have 50, 100, and 200 pixels, and we're setting that, but we still have other items coming over here. That's interesting, right? When we set up our grid template 50, 100, and 200 pixels, and we're setting that, but we still have other items coming over here. That's interesting, right?
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4.
When we set up our grid template columns and grid template rows, we are explicitly stating how big they must be. So that's here, right here. I'm explicitly saying that I have a row of 50, a row of 100, and a row of 200. So it's 50, 100, and 200. As well as my one column right now, which is 200 pixels wide. Sometimes columns and rows are created automatically, and these are implicit rows and columns. So one example of that would be these ones down here. They're not on this 50, 100, 200, but they're still flowing down. And the reason this is happening is because, well, they need somewhere to live. So these are getting automatic rows created for them that I haven't created. Another example would be here, where this is another use case where, say, we have our green box here. It's on our 1 to 2, and it's on our grid row of 2 over 3, and our grid column of 1 over 2. So what would happen, though, if I had another grid item that had a row of 2 over 3, but it had a grid column of 5 over 6? We don't have a line 5 or a line 6. Where would it go? What do you think? It would automatically create a line 5 and 6 for me. That's what it would do. And this is pretty useful in a way, but these are the implicit lines. I haven't explicitly stated that these columns should exist, but because I have a grid item that is living in those lines, the browser is creating them for me implicitly. So they're not explicitly stated, they're implied that they exist, so they're being implicitly created. They are implied that they exist when I did this, even though there's nothing telling them that they should really exist. And, well, how big should these be? They'll default to auto for both width and height, so they'll just try and match the content of whatever is inside of them. If we want, though, we can actually state how big we want them to be by using grid auto rows and grid auto columns. So let's go and take a look at that, and we're going to play with this a little bit. So here where I have my rows, I have 50, 100, and 200, but as I said, so that's 50, 100, 200, but these three down at the bottom, they never got anything defined. So if I come and I say grid auto rows are 500 pixels, I'm still going to have a 50, a 100, and a 200. But then after that, I'm going to have all the other ones that were automatically created are 500 pixels tall. And we can do the same thing across on columns. So say here, what we're going to do is we're actually going to take our big, and we're going to say this big has a grid column of 4 over 5. And, whoa, that completely changed my layout. What? How did that happen? Think about that for a second.
So 1, 2, 3. So 4, 5. All right.
Why all of a sudden did my layout completely change? Well, by saying this lives on grid column 4/5, we're saying we have 4 columns, because remember it's line 1, line 2, line 3, line 4, line 5. We're implying that we have 4 columns. So it's going to automatically create the column for us where this one would have to live. And because if it's creating this one, it has to create all the columns in between. So all of these other items here, they're getting automatically just placed into those extra columns that were just created. These are the implicit grid. They're implied because I've created this, even though I never said anywhere that those columns should exist. And what we can do is have our grid auto columns have a width of 50 pixels. And then this first one is going to keep the 200 pixel because I stated that one explicitly. But then anything that was automatically created or that's implied will go to a width of 50 pixels, which is even too small for the items that are in there. So maybe we'll move this one up to 120 pixels or something like that. There we go. So at least there's enough room for them. So I think that's really interesting. Now, what I'll do is let's move this one up to 300. And we'll come here and create another one that is 500 pixels. And so we have my 250, my 500, and then these last two now are going to the auto ones because these are the ones that are implied and not ones that I've explicitly created. Is this something that's going to come up a lot? No, it's not something that will probably come up on a regular basis because usually you're going to be defining the columns you're working on. You're not going to be shooting something out randomly to lines that don't exist, but either through a mistake that you make where you put in a grid column that doesn't really exist, it's automatically going to create it for you. That's really important to understand. And that the fact that it automatically creates those other columns, even though I never told it to. So those items got placed into columns that previously didn't even exist. That's a really interesting behavior that sometimes you can use to take to your advantage when you're creating your layouts. Grid areas are one of my very favorite things about how the grid works, and it is another property that we're going to be looking at. But the reason I love them is because keeping track of rows and column numbers can be a pain at times. Like really, when you end up getting into these more complex layouts, it really isn't always the most fun. And we can simplify things by assigning grid areas. When we create grid areas, we're effectively giving names to the different parts of our grid, and then we can use the names to assign them to different items really, really easily. It can seem like a bit of extra work at first. It really does. You're going to be going, Kevin, we can just use numbers for this. It's not any faster. And I was part of that camp. I ignored grid areas for the longest time because it seemed like too much work. It didn't seem worth it. But then all of a sudden I realized there is something magical about grid areas. And we're going to get there. But first we're going to explore how they work. So I can do something like this, display grid. We've seen that. I can create my template rows, my template columns. We have a layout that looks like this. And then we get to this really interesting grid template areas property. So on the grid template areas property, we have to use quotation marks, which is kind of weird. And what we do is we open quotation marks and close quotation marks. And we're defining pretty much the first row. So we know my first row is broken into 3 columns. So I'm going to say header, header, header. And then I can say sidebar, content, content. So what it's going to do is it's going to create areas like this. It's going to literally give those areas names. So my first row, it's header all the way across. And then my second row is sidebar and then content, content. Now you notice there's no comma separation here. It's just the open quotation marks and close quotation marks. And when you open the next set of quotation marks, you've moved down to your next column. This is a little bit weird. This throws people off. This is where the most problems will come up, is forgetting quotation marks or other things along the way. And you also don't have to lay it out exactly like this, but it's sort of become standard to do it this way because it makes it the easiest way to visualize what's going on. Now, we've created our areas, but we also need to be able to assign them to the different items. It's super easy to do. You choose your selector and you give it a grid area and you give it the name you want. So grid area, content, but there's no quotation marks here. So just main content can be grid area, content, and we're good to go. So let's go and try that out. We'll come back down to this example that we have here. So we have our display grid, we have some columns, and I'm going to come on here and say grid template areas. All right, so on my grid template areas, let's just create a few different ones. And in general, when I do this, the easiest thing to do is actually to come onto another line and just hit tab so you know that you're still inside of your grid template areas. And you'll see why in a second. So again, you have your quotation marks, and let's do the same we had it before: header, 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 just like that. And you could come here and then say sidebar content, content, and you've defined both of them. So this is my first row, this is my second row, but man, that's hard to look at and understand what's going on. Whereas if you just push return now, we're still under my grid template areas, and it's a bit easier to see what my layout is shaping up to look like. And even we could push this a little further, and we could say like a footer, 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 like that as well. Just make sure you do keep the semicolon at the end, because I've had times where I have all that, I come down and I keep writing other stuff, and it doesn't work because I forgot the semicolon that needs to go here. So just because we're so busy with quotation marks and other stuff, make sure that you don't forget that right there. So for this to work, let's come over and assign a few new names to my grid items here. So we can call this first one here my header. We'll call this one here my sidebar. And we'll come down on this last one, and we'll call this one my footer. And I'm purposely skipping a few of these and leaving them with nothing on it, just so we can see what happens to them when they don't fit in, because I do think that's interesting. Actually, what I'm going to do for the moment is I'm going to turn those ones off that we're not using, and we'll come back and turn them back on once we're ready to use them. And we'll keep our big to put onto our main content area. So we'll switch these back on after, but for now we have our header, our sidebar, our big, and our footer right there. So let's go and take a look at how we can use it. So we've defined the areas. Once we've defined the areas, the next step is to go ahead and assign them. So I have my header, grid area is header. And let's go see if that worked. And boom, it goes all the way across the top. You don't have to worry about numbers. You don't have to worry about anything else. It just worked. Let's keep going, because I think that's so cool. The next one we'll do is my sidebar, grid area sidebar. Then we can have our big. The big one can go into our grid area content. And then we have my footer, which we can give the grid area footer. Let's go take a look. Oh, just like magic, it is all lined up, and isn't that cool? I find that so cool. I find that so much fun that you can just plop this down and things magically appear where you want them to be. And if I come here and I change something,
that's interesting. Like, I've never think of CSS as like it can automate. Like, it's smart. This is smart. Never think CSS would be able to do such things like this.
Say I want sidebar, sidebar. Well, now my sidebar is stretching like that. Like, look how fast and easily I changed that layout.
Wow.
Oh, what? I want my sidebar to go all the way to the top. Sidebar. And it goes all the way to the top. But remember, you can't do weird shapes. Everything has to be a rectangle. So if I try doing sidebar like that, but then I also want it to fit into here and make this weird like sideways T type shape, well, I just broke everything. It gets confused. It doesn't know what to do. So the whole thing is busted. So just be careful when you're doing it that something like that doesn't happen. You do need to keep the shapes. I have a rectangle here.
Just rectangle.
Rectangle, rectangle. But if you don't have a rectangle, or if I try throwing like a header over here as well, again, it gets confused because now I have two different header areas. It doesn't really work. So just to keep consistent and pay attention. But man, it's so cool that we can do that. And really importantly, I have my grid template columns here defined, but I never defined any grid template rows. But it's automatically making rows for me. The rows are the height of the elements that were here. So it's just automatically going. This is going to stretch across all three rows because that's what I want it to do, because that's where the sidebar is going right now. So it's just going to adapt to the height of adding all three of those together. If I wanted to, we could come on and say grid auto.
Column is the width. So how?
Rows are 350 pixels. And then each one of those rows would be 350 pixels, and we'd have to scroll up and down to see it all. But just to say we could do that, or we could explicitly say that we have a grid template row of, say, 100 pixels for my header, 500 pixels for that other area, and 50 pixels for my footer. And make sure it's rows and not row. And now we have a bit of, now our layout is sort of working again. So if you want to, you can define them, but you do not have to. It really depends on the layout and what you're trying to pull off. Now the last thing I'm going to do is come back to here like I promised. Let's turn this back on and turn this back on and go and take a look at what that's done. And they just get stuck down at the end. They're just like, okay, all this space is taken up and I'm just going to, I'm just going to start creating new stuff. Now I know I have 3 columns to place myself along. Why do I know I have 3 columns? Because we have our columns defined right here. They're just flowing along in a new implicitly created row going along those columns that I created. So if there's any extra stuff, it just keeps going. It doesn't matter if we don't have an area specifically defined for it. Now, again, we have to create our rows or our columns, and then we have to come and create our areas. It seems like a lot of work, but in the next video, you're going to see the real magic behind where grid template areas comes in. So now it's time for the real magic of grid template areas. Now, before we actually get into that, one thing I want to look at is that when we go smaller than this, we're getting side scrolling because we've created a really non-dynamic website. We've set exact sizes on this, so we can't actually get smaller than that. We just get some side scrolling. We're not being very responsive right now. But we're getting into now as we're building up to making the grid responsive, because it is inherently something that can be very responsive. And that is by building our media queries and using grid template areas with those media queries. So to start with, the first thing I want to look at is something we can do where we can use a dot when we're in here. And if we use a dot anywhere, what it means is just ignore it. There's no name really assigned to that, so nothing, it's creating an empty cell effectively. So if I have an empty cell there and an empty cell there, we could do something like that where we're just lining this grid area up in there on its own. If I left that blank, you can see it's actually broken my layout because it gets confused. It doesn't understand why there's 3 columns, and then 2 columns. Whereas here, if we add the dot in, it fixes it again because now I've assigned it 3 columns, even though one of them is blank. And you can also come and put a whole bunch of dots here just to balance things out. Sometimes to, if you had another one to come after that, so say here I had also dot, and maybe I'd have my dots here. And again, it's just to create sort of a more visually obvious thing that's going on. And you can see that my items are still working, but it's getting a little ugly, but it is working. And the reason this is really important is for what I'm going to do next. Let's delete a little bit of stuff from here. And we're going to sort of start from scratch a little bit, but that's okay. You're going to see the payoff in a second. So I'm going to take these grid template columns here, and let's change this a little bit. I'm going to put 1M, auto, 1M. And I'm going to shrink this down for a second. So we're on a mobile display. And I'm going to say header, header, header. So my header can go all the way across. Then I'm going to say dot, space, content, dot. Then I'm going to say that I have my dot sidebar, dot. And then we can say that my footer goes all the way across. So we define it for all 3 columns. And now we start getting a bit of that's interesting, right? And I put 1M here just to create like a bit of a space. Let's maybe bring these up to like 5 just for now. And we're going to see other things that we can put in there to balance it out. But, we can start seeing how a layout is starting to come together here a little bit. So that's interesting. But at large screen sizes, I want my sidebar to pop up next to here. So this is where the real power of grid template areas comes in. Because I've defined all of this already, remember when we did the other one, I was redefining my columns, I was redefining my rows, and then I had to go through and redefine all of my line numbers too. And that was a bit of a nightmare, and it was a little bit confusing probably, because it was like, man, which line numbers where? I'm creating empty columns and rows, and my goodness, this is weird. When you use your grid template areas, first of all, it's easier to visualize what's going on. So if I do at media, let's make it relatively small. We'll say in here that we have a minimum width of, 600 pixels, let's say. I'm going to do my dot grid, and we can say that my grid template columns, we still have to redefine these to make it work properly. Remember when we did that, our card, and it got a little bit confusing at one point because I had to redefine my columns, I had to redefine my rows, and then I had to go through on all of the different elements and reposition them on their rows and columns that they were put on. And that was a nightmare, and it was probably a little bit confusing just because we had some empty columns in there, and there was just some straight up like it takes a little bit to wrap your mind around it. Whereas here, right away, it's easier to visualize exactly what the layout's going to look like, but even better. And this is really cool. You're going to see how it's going to work. So here, let's set this up as like, we'll set 100 pixels here, 300 pixels here, 100 pixels here, and 100 right there. So that's exactly 600 pixels. And we'll see what this does. So now where the real magic happens is on my grid template areas. When we do my grid template areas, like this is, I love this so much. I'm excited just thinking about this. And that's maybe a little sad, but I find this so cool. So what we do now is we say that we want my header, and the header is going to go 4 times because we have 4 columns. So that's cool. We'll come down to the next one, which will be my dot because I want an empty space. I'm going to do my content, my sidebar next to it, and then my dot. And last but not least, we'll have my footer go all the way across the bottom. And so let's go take a look, and we can see that layout has come together. But where this is really, really cool is at big screens, it's looking like that. When we go to small screens, oh, it's adapted. And it goes back up, and it goes back. I didn't have to go into any of these and redefine anything in it because I defined their grid area. So it's looking at where the header is, and it's just repositioning it across that. I could literally take my header and push that, like, we could have my header instead of being there. We could say that the first one's actually completely empty, and my header is going to get positioned over here instead. And now my header's over there instead. We have an empty one at the top, header's there, and at the small screens, it repositions itself. So not only is it a bit easier to understand what's going on because you can look at it like this and sort of visualize what your layout's looking like, but you can also, when you get into the media queries, there's so much less work. It's just incredible. You have to set up your columns, maybe you have to set up some rows, and then you just redistribute your areas and everything falls into place. And it's so, so beautiful. I love this so much. So what I encourage you to do now is play around with it, create another media query, have everything repositioned again, and make sure you're really comfortable with it. And then when you're ready, you can go on to the next lesson.
Let's go on. Let's go on. Min-max.
All right, onto this really cool value that we now have that is exclusive to Flexbox, which is min-max. It's sort of like setting a minimum width and a max width to our columns and rows. We've already played with the min width and max width on like actual elements, but now in the elements, it's on the rows or the columns. So when we assign a size to our grid template columns or rows, we don't have to give it a specific size. We can assign the minimum or maximum. Now, have you noticed here, as I said before, we're not really responsive. We're switching here. I guess it's a little bit responsive, but we're sort of locked in. We're using set pixel values. Where min-max is really interesting is you can say what's the minimum size and the maximum size for anything that we're dealing with. This does take a little playing around with to really get used to it. To do it, you do min-max, open and close parentheses, and inside the parentheses, you have a minimum and maximum value. The minimum's always on the left, the maximum is always on the right, and they're always comma separated, and they just are. So, sometimes you have a minimum on side. All right, onto this really cool value that we now have that is exclusive to Flex. Now, in the elements, it's on the rows or the columns. So when we assign a size to our grid template columns or rows, we don't have to give it a specific size. We can assign the minimum or maximum. Now, have you noticed here, as I said before, we're not really responsive. We're switching here. I guess it's a little bit responsive, but we're sort of locked in. We're using set pixel values. Where min-max is really interesting is you can say what's the minimum size and the maximum size for anything that we're dealing with. This does take a little playing around with to really get used to it. To do it, you do min-max, open and close parentheses, and inside the parentheses, you have a minimum and maximum value. The minimum's always on the left, the maximum is always on the right, and they're always comma separated, and they just are. So, sometimes with CSS, things are comma separated, sometimes they're not. We just have to memorize when they are and when they're not, because there doesn't seem to be a lot of consistency. One thing that's important is if your minimum value is bigger than your maximum, it will just ignore it and they'll use that as a maximum. Or if your maximum is smaller than your minimum, it sort of gets ignored as well, and you only have a minimum size that is set. So always make sure it's smaller on the left, bigger on the right, so you know exactly what you're going to get. Now, it doesn't just have to be pixels. We haven't been doing much, but we can use percentages, we can use ems, and pretty much any other unit you can think of. So let's go and try that really, really quickly with what we've been playing with here. So I'm not going to do it on the small screen sizes, but on the big screen sizes, I'm going to change right now. I'm just going to worry about this one right here in the middle. So we're going to change this to a min max. And I'm going to say a minimum of 200 pixels with a maximum of 1,000 pixels. So let's let it get really, really big. And let's go take a look now. And look, well, it's stretching now. So that one is willing to grow and shrink. This is locked into place. But now, instead, we're starting to get a little bit responsive. Isn't that fun?
Mm-hmm.
Look at that. And instead of 1,000 pixels, we could say 100% even. So it's willing to get as big as its parent. Now, it can never get there because other things are in the way, but that means no matter what size our screen gets to, that item will keep growing, and that can be really, really useful. And of course, we don't just have to have a min-max on one of them. So let's say this becomes like, I don't know, I'll lock it in at 700 pixels just for now. And we can do another min-max here, min-max. So the minimum is 100 pixels, the maximum is 200 pixels. And this is where it gets a little bit more interesting, because at the smallest size, we don't have to stress about it too much. But when we get to the bigger sizes, you're going to see at one point, this hits its maximum. So this one is shrinking a bit. So that grid item on the right is shrinking. But when you get to the maximum size, it locks in. It will never get bigger than the 200 pixels because that's its maximum size. And we could do the same thing here. This could be like a 200, 500. So it's willing to shrink. You can see them both shrinking there. Then this one gets to its maximum size and stops growing. The other one keeps growing though until we get to that maximum of 500 pixels, and then it stops growing as well. So really, really cool. Something that's really fun to play with. That's about it.
This is probably the best things about CSS. A little like heavy on the key on the property, but I feel like this is probably the best things for CSS. It is like, how can I say it? It is flexible and it's feel like it's responsive. It's like you can customize it so that it fits your needs, and yeah. Working with CSS is like a nightmare to me, but this doesn't feel like too too constrained. Feel like that is a good word, but no. But doesn't feel like too restricted, probably. Yeah, but let's move on.
We're going to get into really good use cases for it now, but maybe you could play around with this a little bit, experiment with it, try different values in there, and see what you can do with it. And then when you're ready, move on to the next lesson. Just like min-max was a new value that we could use with grid, the FR unit is a new unit that we can use with grid. And it's a way that we can get our rows and columns to behave a lot more like flex items. And that's really useful because right now we saw min-max, and that allowed us to start getting a little bit more responsive. But there are certain limitations to what we were just looking at and the way the maximum and minimum sizes were working. So the FR unit is used to distribute a fraction of the available space that is left over. By using this for the size of a grid item, it becomes a flexible item, and it behaves much more like a flex item does when it has its flex set to 1-1 auto. So if it has the grow and the shrink both set to auto, it sort of is where the behavior starts to mimic a little bit. It's the easiest way to create columns of equal sizes. So let's go and check that out. So right now I have 150, 150, 150, but that locks us in at 150 pixels each. Right, that's awkward, and we could switch that over to min maxes each. So min max of, say, a minimum of 50 pixels with a maximum of, I don't know, 500 pixels. And then we could repeat that a whole bunch of times, but that's kind of annoying too, right? I mean, first of all, that's really long to write. And eventually we get to where we want it to be. We have 3 columns, they're growing, they're shrinking. That's cool. But instead of all that, we could just come here and say 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. And so it's each one is one fraction of the available space, and it's going to grow with our screen and it's going to shrink with our screen, and it won't get too small. We're hitting a minimum because of the padding I have on here and the content that's inside of them, but it is nice and flexible, and it's growing and shrinking really, really nice. And the interesting thing with the FR unit is it's a lot like the flex grow and the flex shrink in that it's a ratio. So I could come on one of these and do a 2FR, and that one is going to take two. It's not actually going to be double the size of the other ones. A lot of it comes down to the content that was in there and the available space that's left over. So it's going to grow and shrink at double the speed pretty much. It's a ratio, just like the flex grow and the flex shrink were ratios. It's working like a flex grow and a flex shrink at the same time. So they will both grow. Now you can see here at one point, these two are locked in, and this one is still growing and shrinking a little bit because of how that's working. So it is a really, really cool unit. And then obviously I could bring
Kind
this
of
one all the
cool.
way up to a 3. And then the same idea is going to imply that one's going to try and be about 3 times bigger, but the content that's inside of these also plays a role in it. And there's some interesting math and everything going on. But a lot of the time, you will have something like 1FR, 1FR, 1FR to create a nice, really simple 3-column grid, and you're off and running. And it is so much fun and so easy to use. And we're going to be using FRs a whole bunch. We've seen FR, we've seen min-max. The FR unit, when using grid, I use FR a lot. It is such a cool unit to use. I use min-max a lot, but we have to be careful because when we mix the two of them, there is a certain limitation. Because of the way the FR unit works, we cannot use it as the minimum size in a min-max. And sometimes I wish we could, but we cannot. So if I come and we take a look at what we were just working on, let's say you wanted to set a minimum size on this middle one. So I said min-max on here, and I wanted the min-max on here to be 200 pixels space or comma 1FR. So at small sizes, it won't shrink below 200 pixels, whereas the other ones will continue to shrink. But at large sizes, it's going to grow with the rest of them. So that's kind of cool and fun, right? So that's neat. But sometimes what happens is you have something like this where you have 200 pixels, 200 pixels, and then you want to do a min max here. But the minimum, you just want it to be whatever the leftover available space is. So you say, I want that to be 1FR, and then the maximum is, say, 500 pixels. And you go, that would be the best case scenario, but it's not working. Why not? Because you can't have an FR as the minimum size. We could do something like this of 0 pixels, comma 500 pixels, and that would work. And then that would mean this one here has a maximum size of 500, and it won't grow bigger than 500, but it will also shrink down to the smallest possible size. And you could even put an auto in there, and it would behave very much in the same way. It's going to grow, it's going to shrink. The auto is going to try and match the minimum content. So if you're trying to use the FR on a minimum size, it's not going to work. On a maximum size, though, it works wonderfully. And again, you might do something like 250 pixels, min max. The minimum is 50 pixels, the maximum is 1FR, and then a 1FR at the end. And you sort of get this interesting play on how everything interacts with each other and how these minimum and maximum sizes all get. So this one's never changing size. This one's willing to change, but it has a minimum set to it. And then that other one is just always a flexible item. So you get these really interesting dynamics that can be built up like that. But really important, if you put an FR here, it won't work. So please don't do it. Do you remember this when we ran into that problem here? So we used Flexbox. We had it like this. We reordered it all using the order. And then we realized we didn't really have enough room, and we saw how we could use negative margins, but we also saw that negative margins created a big problem here. So what I want to do in this video is deconstruct a little bit of what we already had and build it back up a little bit like we did with our card before to get it working and get it working a lot better. So let's go and take a look. I have made some changes in the code. So the very first thing I've done is I've flattened out what we had here. Because you might remember, my article featured I left alone actually, but on my recent articles, you remember I used to have a main and a secondary class. So we had two divs there. And that's because when we got to the largest screen sizes, we were actually breaking the layout and changing it even more. We were getting a two-column layout here. And we had to sort of reorganize that to pull that off. We don't need to do that in this case. So I've taken that out, and we could do that a little bit differently. But for now, we're just going to be focusing on sort of this layout. So we can flatten everything out, and we don't need to have those extra divs, which is really, really nice. And in my styles, I've stripped out anything that was related to Flexbox. So I've left these selectors here empty just because it was only flex items on there, and I just deleted everything in the media query because we can come back in and fix that up a little bit when we get there. So if we come and look what we want to do on this, well, we don't actually need these anymore because they don't exist anymore. There will be a few more selectors that we will need, but on my article recent, what I do want to do is a display of grid on here. Once again, that's just going to make all my margins start not collapsing anymore, so that should space things out a little bit. We'll have to deal with that at one point. So now what we want to do is create our grid. And what I'm going to do is create a two-column grid for small screens. And we can play with this grid a little bit depending on what is happening and what is going on. So let's do this as a grid template columns. And I'm just going to do a 1FR, 1FR to make two equal columns. Now, the annoying thing with grid is whenever we do this, the whole layout's pretty much always going to break, and that means we have to reposition everything on there. So I do know that sometimes isn't a ton of fun, but it's not as bad as it looks. But what I will also do now is my grid template areas. And with the grid template areas, we can come in and we'll set them up. So at first, I want to have, what do we want? We want to have the
Image.
first one is going to be my image. My second one is going to be my title, and I'm just going to write date, even though I guess info would be better there. And then here we can have our body, and then at the bottom we can have our read more and blank. And now what we can do is go on each thing and tell it where it lives on there. So we can have my article image has the grid area of image, my article title has the grid area of title. We have my article info, which has the grid area of, I've said it's date. As I said, I maybe should have given that a different name. My article body has the grid area of body. And if we set it up just like that and we come take a look at that, it's just rearranged itself. And that's pretty cool, I think. Now there are a few issues with it, obviously. It's definitely not working perfectly. This is sort of just locked in at that space because it is left aligned and this cell it's in is right there. Now what I think I might do is actually make this a 2FR instead. So we can also come on, that is my article info. And so on here, I'm also going to add in a justify self end, just to push it all the way over to the end there. And that looks a little bit better.
Wow.
We are still running into that problem where
Looks
this is taking
amazing.
up a lot more room than it needs to. So instead of using FR here, we're going to look at a new one, which is, there's two different choices. We have min content, which min content we don't really want to use. Min content is going to shrink it down as small as it possibly can. So it's the smallest thing inside of this, the smallest piece of content is this word of comments. So this row is literally now the width of the word comments. So I don't find that's really working for me because it's a little bit too small. But we can also use a max content. And max content's really, really cool because what max content is going to do is it's going to keep it all on one line of text pretty much. So, but it's going to shrink this down to match the height right there, and it's going to set that up just like that. So you can see here that actually looks pretty good, and I'm pretty happy with that. Now we have this big issue. So again, min content will shrink things down to be as small as they possibly can be, whereas max content will shrink it. It's a little weird because it's saying max, so you're thinking it's going to get really, really big. This is a max content is really, really similar to when we first do display flex. So remember, when we do display flex, everything shrinks to fit the content that's inside of it. That's exactly what's happening here. it's shrinking to fit the content, but at its maximum size. So it's not breaking this across lines. Now, if your content's too big, so something like this that's wrapping on multiple lines, well, then it won't really shrink down too much. But as long as it's something that's pretty small, it's going to shrink and match the width of that. Now, I'd originally set this all up on one line because when you just start setting up grid areas, it can be a little bit easier to read, but we are getting into a few of these that are going to be on multiple lines. So what I'm actually going to do is just anything that does need to be on multiple lines, I'm going to move right to the end so I can keep these other ones nice and clean, just like that. Another thing you'll see a lot of the time when you have something like this is a little bit of extra space to line everything up nicely just to make it a little bit cleaner. But it's, it's the one time where we can line things up really singular like that, because it actually is pretty easy to read and understand what's going on with that. The other thing I want to do on this is actually on my article info and my article title to do a align self. And I'm going to use the one that I said I never use, baseline. And that's because we have a big font size on this one and a small font size on that, and it's going to get the baseline of both of them to line up with each other. If we use center in this case, they're still probably going to look a little bit off. There's margins involved in them, so it's not really matching exactly like you'd expect it to. Whereas if I use baseline, it's the one time where that's probably the one that we want to be after. So now if we go to the smaller sizes, it will actually push my title out of the way. Now you might be going, well, that's not ideal. This is getting... I don't really like how that's working because this is set here. So maybe you would want to actually switch that over. I'm going to leave it as a max content, but maybe you could come up with a reason for having it as a min content. And oh, they're stuck together. How can we fix that? It is going to be up here on the parent. Do you remember how you can add a little bit of space there? So what we can do is
try it. Grid. This is column gap. Let's do 1M. Commas. Where is it now? The dumpling one. Where's the dumpling? Wait, what? Where's my dumpling? Is it grid gap? Grid gap would apply both of it. Grid gap columns, state columns, gap to be, yeah.
Is our grid gap. Now I only want the gap on the row. I don't want it on the column.
Oh yeah, the row.
Columns. So I'm going to do this as a 0 for the columns and 1M for my rows. We can come and take a look, and it has added that space there. Now it depends. There we go. So they'll never touch each other, pretty much is what's going to happen there. And so I know it's not a perfect example, but I do think it's a nice way that we can look at how that would work. And once again, because we've set this up, all I need to do now is in my media query, come and we only need this right here. So I'm just copying and pasting to get to that. And we can redefine what this actually looks like at large screen sizes. So maybe now, and we might need to redefine our columns as well. So let's go and grab that at the same time. So if we go back to what it looked like at large screens, we had our image as sort of a smaller column, and then we had our big column over there. So we could do something like that where it's image title. Then we have our image and our body. Then we still have our image and we have our read more. And then underneath all that, we have our info, which, did I call it info? The date. And I'm just going to leave that one blank there, or I mean, it technically could be date going all the way across. And Let's just see what that does without changing even my columns. Let's go and take a look. There we go. So this is set to min content right now. So obviously it's a complete disaster. It's just not working at all. So let's go and fix that. So I think what I would do here instead is maybe set something else where I'd set this maybe to 250 pixels and then use a 1FR. So the right one is using all the available space that would be on there. And now we can see that it shrinks and grows, or maybe better than 250 pixels might be a min max, where we could come on here and say a min max of say 175 pixels, comma 250 pixels. So we give it a minimum and maximum size all at the same time. And now it's starting to look pretty good. The one thing is this is in the wrong place because we did give that the justify self end. So I'm also going to take this here and bring that into my media query. And we don't need to worry about that, but here we can put this back to start. And if you remember, it's working. It should be working. My image should be stretching that whole size, but I could do this anywhere. Let's just keep it inside my media query, where the last thing we'll do is my article image has a width of 100% and a height of 100%. And of course, an object fit of cover so it doesn't get all weird looking. And I'm going to actually make this get a little bit smaller, or have a smaller possible minimum size, just so we can see that what it looks like. So I think there we can see at smaller sizes, it's pushing the limits a little bit maybe. Then we can go and it looks pretty good.
Wow.
It's not really shrinking down though, because we have it set to the 1FR for this, which is the available space. So I think what would be better here is to also have a min max on that one and have this one set to like 250 pixels minimum, 1FR as the large size, and maybe even this could be like 350. So that ensures we sort of always have enough space there and it's going to work. Maybe we could play with those numbers and get it to balance out a little bit better, but we can play around and get things exactly how we want them to be. There are some margin issues in a few things here, but I really love how we, just by changing our template areas here and just, you know, a couple of overwrites here and there, we can completely redefine what that layout looks like. But we've been looking at components a lot, and a lot of the time grid isn't necessarily components. It's not necessarily components we're looking at. Often it's on larger scale things, and the components we're still using Flexbox because components are much simpler than the big picture layout. So in the next video, we're going to be taking a look at grid on a bigger picture instead of these little components like this one. So as I mentioned at the end of the last video, often grid is used for larger layout tools instead of looking at individual components. So let's take a look at how we can do a portfolio like this. And through this, we're going to do a couple lessons that are going to be looking at this because we're going to see how grid actually allows us to sometimes just completely avoid media queries as well. So this is a really interesting and fun one. What we're going to be doing first is I want you to set up a grid that's going to give us 3 columns like that. So we already have in here portfolio items all across here, and they're in something called a portfolio card. And whoops, I put this comment in the wrong spot. So let's go and fix that. So I have my portfolio card, portfolio card, portfolio card. In each one, we have an image at the top, an H3, and a paragraph. Now this image is coming from something called OnSplashIt, so you'll see there's no JPEG or anything like that. It's a placeholder service. If you change the numbers here, it will change the size of the image that's actually inside of it. And the images, when you try this or if you reload the page, they may be different from the one I have because it just automatically puts in an image in there. So just why this might not look like a typical image to you right now. So if we come and look at it, we have our portfolio. It's not too fancy at the moment, but at least there's something there. So before we go to my CSS, the parent for all this is my portfolio. So I want you to try and come in here and in the portfolio, set up a grid that's going to give us the 3 columns across that these can line up on and also include the gap that's going to be in between. And also make sure we include some spacing that can go in between those as well. So how'd that go? Hopefully it went well. Some spacing that can go in between. And also make sure we include some spacing that can go in between those as well.
Portfolio would be like what, display grid? Oh, like the Why is it not working? Why is it not working? Why is it not working? Oh, you want the spacing. This, the white thingy, margin, 1M. Portfolio here.
So how'd that go? Hopefully do that, we probably won't even see a change because there's no margins that will stop collapsing in this case. Now what we can do is set up my grid template columns.
Display grid template columns 1FR. All right. Boom.
And in this case, and I'm only doing the same number here, so I'm not putting 2 because it's going to give it to me on my columns and my rows. And if we come take a look, well, it's sort of working, but my goodness, what happened to my title here? Or is a little bit there. But I mentioned that with grid, we want to keep things flat, so I don't want to have like portfolio and then a portfolio grid. I definitely could do that actually, and probably wouldn't be the end of the world. But is there a way we could solve this and make the portfolio title stretch the whole way across the top without changing anything in the markup? See if you can think of a solution and see if you can get it to work.
Okay, so we need 2. We have 3 row, right? Oh, we have 3 column grid areas. We have one called header. Copy and paste. Boom, boom. So there's 3. This is so there's only 3 row. My bad. All right. What is it called? Cards. Here, cards. Portfolio title, grid, what is it called? Grid area, title, headers. How did I say grid area? Grid. I forgot the key for it. Display. Not display grid. Grid template. Forgot the what is it called? CSS trick. Grid column start. Grid areas, not grid areas. It calls something else. Do, do, do. Let's just, yeah, keep watching here.
First line in my column to the very, very end, and that makes it take up its own row.
I overcomplicated that. So, grid columns 1 over -1. And then grid gap would be, so for each row, let's say just say 1m. That's all right.
Oh, it's effectively made it, it's still on my grid, but it's taking up an entire row, and now everything else just sort of falls into place, which is really nice and handy, and I think pretty cool. So I think that looks pretty nice already. But there's some cooler stuff that we can do with this. We're going to be looking at one of those things in the next video. So this is a nice, short, easy thing to do, but it's going to help us a little with what we're working on right now, and that is the repeat value. So this is something, once again, that is unique to Flexbox, a little bit like min-max and all those other things we were looking at. And when we're defining our template rows or template columns, if we have multiple columns that are the same width, we can use something called repeat, or this thing called repeat. This makes our lives easier, and it is super useful with the FR unit to make quick multi-column layouts as long as all those columns are the same size. So to use it, first we define how many times we want it to be repeated and then the size that we want each one of those things to be. And really important, the two values must be comma separated. So for example, if we wanted to create a 4-column grid, I would have grid template columns, repeat, and then inside the parentheses, 4. So I want to repeat it 4 times, each one of 300 pixels. So let's give it a try, but I don't want you to do it with 4 columns. I want you to replace what we have here with a repeat that's going to do it, but to make our 3 columns. So let's go and do that. So I'm going to set it up, repeat, and I'm going to want 3 columns. So I do a 3, and let's just do 100 pixels for now, and we'll explore it a little bit. So when I do 100 pixels, well, look at that. It's 100 pixels, each one of my columns, and it gets locked in. But as I said, with the FR unit, it's much more interesting. So we can do 1 FR in there. And look at that, just like that. We have 3 completely flexible columns. It's almost like magic. I love it so much. And one thing that's actually a little bit more powerful is we can put a min-max in there as well. So I could say a minimum of 200 pixels, a maximum of 300 pixels if we wanted to. And then it's going to be a minimum. So at one point there will be a minimum and it will cause side scrolling because they can't get smaller than that. Or a maximum of 350, which I can't get to on my screen size right now. So let's maybe shrink that down. Or it was only 300 too. I'm going to make this one like 100, so it's a lot smaller. And we'll make the maximum 200, just so we can illustrate exactly what's going on here. So we can see that it's maxed out at 200. It will shrink, but then it will stop shrinking at one point, and we can't move anything from there. So if you do want to have something like that, you can. But often for a layout like this, you'll have something like a 1FR, and it just makes it very flexible, and we can do, it's a very easy way to make a bunch of columns really, really fast and easily. Now, it doesn't have to be set up like this. You could have something like 200 pixels, space, repeat 3FR as well. So that means my first column will be locked in at 200 pixels, and then the other ones will be flexible in the leftover space. So it doesn't have to be something where it's doing all the columns. It can be used to create something in the middle, and then maybe you have another space over on this side, which is a set size as well. Now I'm going a little too big for what we're doing. It's breaking our page a little bit, but you get the idea that these 3 in the middle are flexible, and these 2 now on the ends are locked in. So before we move on to the next one, I'm just going to fix this, bring it back to repeat 3, 1 FR, and that is really cool. But in the next lesson, I'm going to show you something that makes this even cooler. So let's go and check that out.
Autofill.
Every time I talk about something with Grid, I get so excited because there's so much cool stuff with Grid, and this is one of those things. When we're using the repeat, like we were just looking at, instead of using a set number of times, like we just did, we had 3, so we did 3, 1 FR. Instead of the 3, we can use 2 keywords. We can use autofit or autofill as well. The two of them are different, though the differences can be confusing at times. So I'm going to try and explain it, but then it'll be a lot more clear, I think, once we actually look at it. But autofit will fit the columns you've defined into the available space. It's a little bit more complicated what's actually going on, but essentially this is what it's doing. Whereas autofill will keep adding in new columns even if they're empty. Are you confused? Let's go take a look, because as I said, I think it'd be a lot more clear. So here, where we have my grid template columns, I can replace this with either autofit or autofill. So I'm going to start with the autofill here, and I'm going to do autofill, and I'm going to give it a min-max, because without the min-max, it doesn't really do much. I'm going to give this a minimum size of 200 pixels, comma 1FR. This is, generally speaking, the large size. You're going to want to give it 1FR, and you will want to give it a minimum size. If not, the autofill won't really be doing its magic. So let's go take a look, and right now, it effectively looks the same. Nothing's really changed. But watch this. As I get smaller, before, just remember what happened before actually. When I got smaller, at one point we'd hit my minimum size. So my minimum size right now is 200. So it'd be 246 plus our gutter spacing there. That would just stop, and then I would get side scrolling, right? Now, what just happened? Oh my goodness. Well, now I have a 2-column layout.
Huh.
Now let's keep going. Let's
This
keep
is
going.
exactly the stuff that
Now,
Bootstrap use.
oh, I get excited
think
still, and
so.
I've played with this a lot. Now I have a 1-column layout. I don't have a media query in here. It's just magically working. 2 columns, 3 columns, 4 columns. And if we go wider, we get 5 and 6 columns.
Easier.
And everything's just automatically flowing and going where it needs to go. Isn't that really cool and really fun? I think that's so cool. So what it's doing is it's saying that it has a minimum size of 200 pixels and a maximum size of 1FR. Right now, these are growing to fit the available space, but it knows the minimum size these are allowed to be is 200 pixels. So when we get to here, if we can fit 3 of them next to each other using that minimum size of 200 pixels, it's going to squeeze them in. So they shrink in size to their minimum, and they all squeeze in next to each other. But then we're allowed to grow, we're allowed to grow, we're allowed to grow. But then, boom, once that minimum size can squeeze down again, and we can fit 4 of them, it's going to do it automatically. That's just so much fun. I think that's so cool. Now,
I'm going
if I
to
switch
apply this onto my portfolio. It might be
this to
nice.
auto fit right now, you won't see a difference. It's going to work exactly the same. Because of how this is laid out, there's not really anything that's going to change in it. So what I'm going to do to illustrate this a little bit better is we're going to leave only 2 portfolio items. And we're going to take all of these other ones off. I'm just going to delete all of those. And I'm also going to come up here and I'm going to comment out my title, because my title is going to cause some problems with it, with how I've set this up, to really illustrate what the difference is. So we're at here, we have my autofill and min-max of 200 and 1FR. Let's go back here for a second and say autofill will keep adding in new columns even if they're empty. So let's go take a look. We're going to refresh here, make sure we're on a blank slate, and let's shrink down. So we have my 1 column, they're stacking. We know that already. Oh, we have room for 2 of them to go next to each other. They will. But here now, this is where we have the new columns will come in even if they're empty. So there's no content to put in this cell, but it's still going to create it because it's adhering to that min max I said. So now we have 200, 200. We had room for another 200. It's going to fit it in there. We have room for another 200. It's going to fit it in there.
So you need to use autofit
like
so that is
and
fit.
switch this to auto fit instead. So auto fit, instead of adding new columns, even if they're empty, it will fit the columns you've defined into the available space. And yes, it's more complicated if you actually look up with the spec, but essentially this is what it's really doing. So as long as that's how you see it, it's all good. So here we have my columns like that. They're going to 1 column, then we go up to 2, but they're going to stay 2 forever now, because I don't have any extra content to add in there. Auto fit I find a little bit more useful in that if I only have 2 items, it's not going to all of a sudden start adding in these random empty columns that I'm not using. It's just going to let my content grow. So it becomes a little bit more versatile. I could use that in different situations, whether I have 3 items or 10 items, and it's always going to work. Whereas the other one, sometimes if I was using it in an area with 10 and it was working well, I might bring that same class down to make 2 columns, but it's going to break it here because then I get all these extra little columns squeezing in. There will be situations where both of them will come up though. So that's the difference between autofit and autofill. If it seems a little bit weird, play around with it a bit in here. Make sure you understand it, because it's a really subtle difference, but it's a really important difference as well.
help you in your job search. Other stretch goals might include using a bit of JavaScript to hide all but your new responsive, wonderfully designed learning journal website or blog. This site has 3 pages that you'll need to build from scratch using HTML and CSS. It's really need to build each of the 3.
Right, we'll do this tomorrow. And yeah. Solo project. Access exclusive responsive design solo project. Deploy your learning journal project. Right, tomorrow we will do